Welcome to MapleWooding.com podcast. We have on the phone Jerry Barca. How you doing, Jerry?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Of course, you are author of Big Blue Wrecking Crew, which is basically the history of the Giants in the 80s and beyond, I guess. And you will be at Word's Bookstore in Maplewood Village Thursday. That's Thursday, October 13th at 7:30 p.m. And another added attraction, Mark Bavaro, will be there in conversation with you. First, let me ask, how did that come about? Did you know Bavaro before this book, or how did you kind of get to know him enough to have him be involved in this event?
Well, I didn't know him before this book at all. I guess I had written my first book on Notre Dame's 1988 national championship team that's called Unbeatable. And, you just build relationships in this business, and people, the thing I have going for me is I'm someone that I think you can trust, that I can be fair with you. I'm not gonna sugarcoat things, but I'll be fair. And
obviously, for those who don't know, Bavaro is a Notre Dame alum.
Yes, yeah.
So you got to know him partly through doing that book?
Not through that book, but
okay.
From guys I had interviewed for that book. I ended up playing with Mark in the pros.
Excellent.
Because Mark, of course, went on to the Eagles, and they were able to vouch for me. So Mark was willing, based on that, to have me at his home up in Massachusetts, and it ended up being 5.5 hours of recorded material for the book, which was great, and it's particularly great because Mark Bavaro is a guy, and I get into this in the book, who didn't speak to the media really at all. They literally, media day for the Super Bowl is media day because of Mark Bavaro and how he was at Super Bowl 21, that he showed up for picture day in his uniform and would not speak to the media, and they got very upset by that. But he said, hey, look, it's picture day. And the NFL was even looking to fine him, but they couldn't because the NFL material said it's picture day. So here's a guy who literally changed media day because he wouldn't speak. So to get him to speak so much and open up about that time period and his experiences was terrific. And you develop professional relationships with subjects that you write about. That's a natural thing that should come out of journalism and writing. And as I'm fact-checking and I'm texting things and I'm watching videos and I'm texting them highlights of the videos or things I have questions on, and then we interact over other conversations, you just sort of develop a rapport. And I just threw it out there to him. One of the things Mark and I spoke about was the love he felt in New Jersey. And especially being an Italian-American. And the Italian-American community in North Jersey, how they gravitated toward him as a player and continue to do so today. And so I threw it out there. I said, hey, I'm doing this signing. Any chance you'd want to come down? So he was all for it. It worked in his schedule, and he'll be there. So that's how it came about. I suppose that might be a little bit of a long answer, but that's how it came about.
The book's subtitle, I think if I'm reading it right, it says Smash Mouth Football, a Little Bit of Crazy, and the 86 Super Bowl champion New York Giants. Now, obviously, this is the 30th anniversary of the 86 Giants. So was that part of the reason that was sort of timely, or there's been a lot, obviously, written about that team sort of immediately after. A lot of books come out when teams win the Super Bowl, but now you're looking back 30 years. It's a little more retrospective. Like you said, it sounds like Bavaro, maybe some other people were a little more open to talking. What kind of have you learned since sort of the first wave of books about that team came out way back then and now today? What sort of is in this that maybe people don't know who follow the Giants?
Well, I mean, when the books first come out, people can't tell you the stories because they're still active in the game. They're gonna get the stories. They're gonna tell you enough stories they can tell you to push a book enough.
Yeah,
and that's what's gonna happen in 1987.
Sure.
And there were 7 books that came.
Oh, I didn't even know that many. I know there were several. Yes.
Yeah. So this book, what people are able to do is tell the stories they couldn't tell, and talk about things that they wouldn't be able to talk about during their playing days, and they're also able to put perspective on things. These are men now in their 50s. that won a championship in New York in the mid-'80s. So now they can kind of put that in perspective that maybe, that certainly that couldn't have existed back in the early '90s even. So that's what I like to do. I mean, there's tons and tons of information that people don't know. It's funny. I was at a party in Doylestown, Pennsylvania this weekend, and somebody had read the book, and they were all. It was this interesting thing that rarely as writers you get, but it was a super lifelong Giants fan and read the book, and here's a guy who has had season tickets for years and travels from Pennsylvania to the game, and he says, there's so many things I didn't know. And I didn't realize I didn't know them. And I think that's the one of the great things about this book. It's going to remind people of that era and of that time with the New York Giants. But there's so much stuff that they didn't know, whether it's, Bavaro as a rookie with wearing cleats that were so small he would have these blisters on his feet.
Oh, my God.
Burst with blood, and he'd have these bloody socks. I hope you're not listening to this during breakfast out there. But he'd have these bloody socks that he wouldn't speak to trainers about because he just didn't want to speak to anybody. He was concerned about making the team. There's things like that. There's things about Bill Belichick and how Bill Belichick...
Yeah, people forget that Bill Belichick was defensive coordinator.
Yeah.
And Tom Coughlin was also a coordinator on that team. And I believe... not Coughlin. He came later.
Coughlin was a wide receivers coach on the 1990 team. But, interestingly, here's what happens. Everybody remembers Phil McConkey for the Giants.
Right, sure. He had a great catch. He had the near catch, and then he had the catch in the Super Bowl.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
He had the near catch, and he got cut by the Giants before the start of the '86 season.
Oh, my God.
They cut him. They cut him loose. And they had a trade to get him back because their punt return game and their receivers got hurt, and their punt return game was so weak. They traded for him back. But who was his receivers coach in Green Bay? Tom Coughlin.
Oh, my gosh.
When he came back to New York, he told Parcells, he said, you would love this guy. You would love this guy. And so that's something that I don't think Giants fans really realize, that there's all these connections. Who the Giants are today, if you grow up in the Eli Manning Giants and you've grown up with, hey, they're winners and they go to the playoffs and they've won 2 Super Bowls, you don't realize, and this is also what the book gets into, is how bad it was in the 70s,
right,
and how awful it was, and that in '86, I mean, there's still ties to the Giants being winners today. It was all built on this '86 team and who the Giants were.
What was maybe the most interesting thing that comes out that maybe people didn't know? You mentioned McConkey and Bavaro. Any others? What about maybe Parcells? He's obviously a well-known guy, but what's involved with maybe what would you say is the most interesting thing?
The rift between Parcells and the general manager, George Young, while they figured out that they could work together for 2 Super Bowls, but because they had a fracture in their relationship, which I get into the book, stopped Bill Parcells from being the Giants coach again in 1997. The Giants were ready to make him the coach in '97. This is when Parcells left the New England Patriots.
Before he went to the Jets.
This was, he ended up going to the Jets.
Right.
But the Giants were...
He was in between the Patriots and the Jets.
Yeah.
What happened there? And Young was still the general manager?
Yep, and Young wasn't going to have it.
Interesting.
George Young has told many people that he feels Bill Parcells is the most duplicitous man I've ever known. And when the Tisch family and the Mara family were finally able to agree on Parcells, it was within moments. Basically, if cell phones existed, Jim Fassel wouldn't have been given the offer to be the head coach of the Giants, and it would have been Bill Parcells. But cell phones weren't prevalent back then, and in these these moments that passed by where the Tisch and Mara family had come together, George Young made sure he made Jim Fassel the offer, and the Giants, as a matter of their business policy, were not going to pull back on that offer.
That's interesting.
So that's how close it came. I mean, but there's tons of things about Phil Simms and what his
do tell. What about Simms? He's often underrated. Many people say, although he had one of the best passing Super Bowls ever, I believe, 22 for 25. But he still doesn't always get the credit. Is that what about Simms? Do you know that maybe people don't know?
Well, there's tons of stuff in the book about Sims and his upbringing, and people know he's one of 8 children, but just how his upbringing was, and sort of it does look at his personality and how he was able to persevere and make it in New York. I think a lot of that comes from being one of 8 kids, growing up hard, but not really realizing it was hard, just knowing this is the way life was, and he kept persevering.
And he grew up in Kentucky?
He grew up in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Had a paper route at 7 years old because the family, if he wanted school supplies, he had to have a job. He had to pay for them himself. There were Christmases with nothing under the tree for the kids, and there were Christmases where all of the brothers got one bike, or you got one pair of pants.
So he was pretty. He was pretty cooperative with the book, or you learned this elsewhere?
Absolutely. Gave me 2.5 hours of his time.
And then, of course, people... what time span does the book really go? Because obviously you're talking about years before the Super Bowl and then years after. What would people say the sort of time frame you look at?
It goes from the infamous fumble in 1978, with Joe Pisarcik, through the Super Bowl, and then there's basically... there's a chapter after that talks of kind of where the characters ended up and mentions the thing about Parcells coming back. And,
excellent.
And really mentions how much of a team, for Giants fans, this is a team of generations. This is the team you pass on to other generations because they were the one.
And it's interesting.
They were the one that broke through.
Talk about the fact that you said, a lot of people are sort of not spoiled necessarily, but the Giants have had a lot of success in the last 10 years. With Eli, they've done well. They've had strong placement in the standings. And then they had a history, obviously, in the 50s of championships and greatness. But then that middle 70s, a lot of people don't know. And I always tell my kids who are, in their teens, the same with the Yankees. You forget in the 80s and the late 60s, the Yankees weren't doing well, and a lot of people who are Yankee fans today sort of are spoiled. What did this team, what sort of brought them, like you said, from the Pisarcik fumble to the championship that maybe people of this generation, younger people, don't realize, or even older people don't know?
Well, I think one of the things, just to talk about the 70s, the state of the Giants organization in the 70s was atrocious. You guys would go into their position meetings in the morning at the facility, then they'd go have liquid lunch on Route 17 in North Jersey. They'd come back. If you practiced hard, you were ostracized.
Wow.
The team. They didn't, So that's probably something people don't realize.
The team was really in disarray, but it was the same ownership. It's obviously been the Mara family all these years, right?
Yeah. Yep. And
so what switched it? Was it George Young coming in, and how did that happen?
Yeah, George Young coming in. He was, basically. Pete Rozelle had to step in and make the appointment, though John Mara told me his dad, Wellington Mara, went to Pete and said, we want George Young, but there was a feud in the family ownership that if Wellington put forth the name, that Tim Mara, his nephew, the co-owner, would have said no, just because Wellington had put forth George Young's name. So there was that feud, and then...
and Tim Mara and Wellington Mara had a long history of not getting along.
That's why Rozelle had to come out and say, I'm going to, how about George Young? What do you guys think? So he was listed as the compromise choice, and Young comes in and he professionalizes the operation, and he brings Ray Perkins in, who is a very stern coach, who, stern to a fault is what it ended up being, because he began to lose the locker room in a sense, but then usher in Parcells. Who almost loses his job in 1983, and that's where the fracture in the relationship with Young happens, and I go into that in detail in the book. So those two guys, you draft a guy like Lawrence Taylor, who is a game changer, and that's not a cliche, that's actually the real deal. He changed the game of football. And you then have a guy like Phil Simms, who has the strength and toughness to battle back after being injured, to finish out 4 of his first 5 seasons after dealing with the abuse from the Giants fans because they didn't like that he wasn't producing, and to stand in there and become the quarterback he became. And those 4 guys, Young, Parcells, LT, and Phil Simms, that's what changes it around. And not to take away from the Carl Bankses, the Harry Carsons,
right,
Bavaro, McConkey, Jim Burt, Joe Morris, of course. I mean, there's plenty of guys who contributed, but I would say those would be the four that shifted the direction in a major way.
And of course, Sims obviously came from Morehead State, which whoever heard of Morehead State in terms of football, and that, I know that was a lot. What was the brainchild? Who was the brainchild behind that? Was that a Parcells pick? Was that a George Young pick? How did that sort of come out? And was there disagreement?
It was the first pick that the Giants had to make after George Young came in and hired Ray Perkins, and Perkins loved Sims. Loved him, and Young knew he loved him. There was big talk back in the day. People might have to Google this if they're a little younger, but the top quarterback taken in that draft was a guy called Jack Thompson, the throwing Samoan out of Washington State. And that was the talk was, hey, we might want to lean toward him. He's played better competition. Now, he flamed out in Cincinnati.
As happened.
And then went on to play with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
And this was the 79 draft? Or the 80?
Yeah, so there's another pretty prominent quarterback taken in that draft.
Joe Montana?
Joe Montana was taken in the third round by Bill Walsh, but Bill Walsh visited Sims and wanted Sims.
Really?
But and there's great detail in the book about that, and you can see one of the themes, and it's not something I've talked about in all of the interviews I've done for the book, but there's the rivalry between Parcells, the Smash Mouth Giants, and the West Coast finesse 49ers, and the sort of theme of Montana versus Sims and that Bill Walsh visit. He visited him twice at Morehead State. And the visits between Ray Perkins and Bill Walsh couldn't have been any different.
Really?
Sims. Yeah. And it's great stuff. So that's the kind of thing, that's what this book is able to do, is get into the origin of how it happened and how it all came together and down the line. And then they hoist the Super Bowl trophy. And the other thing, Joe, is that people forget this is the first team. Everybody does the Gatorade bath now.
Right, that's what I remember. The Gatorade started, it was Harry Carson, right?
Well, actually, it was Jim Burt. Harry made it a cottage industry for himself.
Really?
But it was Jim Burt, and it's a very interesting story. Doesn't necessarily. I'm just all I'm going to say. I don't want to be Mr. Spoiler here.
No, tell the truth. That's what we want.
Of course, I want people to be out there at Words and buy the book.
Yes, you're giving us plenty of whetting our appetites for more, so that's great.
Yeah, but it's not a celebration. That's all I'll say. It was with Jim Burt, and it wasn't a celebration for
Really?
Marcel.
How did it come about?
Well, I'm not going to give you that one. That one you got to read. You got to read.
Well, I'm going to read.
That's all.
But because it did start in the season. During the season,
it started a couple years before.
Oh, okay, you're giving us reason to look even further. And of course, Jim Burt went on to the Niners and won the Super Bowl there as well. But it's interesting you talk about and again we're talking about the Big Blue Wrecking Crew with Jerry Barca. He'll be at Words Bookstore on Thursday night with Mark Bavaro, one of the many characters in the book. But you talk about the Montana and Sims being drafted the same year, Sims being drafted ahead of him. And then in the 80s, of course, those were two of the powerhouses that did a lot of battle in the playoffs, the Niners and the Giants. And the whole NFC sort of dominance in the 80s included the two of them. Obviously, the Niners won more Super Bowls, but the Giants were always in there. And that 86 team. What would you say, and then we'll let you go, what would you say is sort of the biggest surprise people might get out of this book who are Giant fans and lived through that time that maybe they didn't realize, if something jumps out?
It's such a difficult question for me to answer.
There's a lot there, I'm sure.
I'll tell you what people have told me, and it's having worked in sports and been around athletes. When they tell this, I'm like, wow. I think the takeaway that I've heard the most from people, and there's a few people that were involved in sports, is the level of drug use.
Yeah, I believe
with the team, and that they were kind of surprised.
Beyond just obviously Lawrence Taylor's is well known, and a few others, maybe, but what, even more than that? Yeah.
So that's what people tell me. That's their biggest. Whoa, I had no idea. And it's funny because I don't, it's the 80s, and that stuff was prevalent back then. And I kind of, crook my head to the side and say, really? But, that's what people, when I get the feedback, that is what people are most surprised about that I've heard. For me, I think it is really some of the things we hit on are, in totality, it's all these characters. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're big personalities.
Yes.
Carl Banks is a big personality. Harry Carson's a big personality. George Martin plays a major role, though he's sort of an understated personality. But you got L.T. Sims, Parcells, Belichick, McConkey, Leonard Marshall, who is an All-Pro on this team as well. How they came together. I mean, even the punter, Sean Landeta.
Yes.
If you think about this, the punter, Sean Landeta, might have been the All-Pro ladies' man of this team.
Really?
He'd go to the China Club. Yeah, he'd go to the China Club in New York City in the 80s on Monday night, and Monday night was celebrity night. You're talking Madonna, Eddie Murphy, and, the National Enquirer's there, People Magazine's there, and they're snapping photos. And who are they opening the velvet rope for but the Giants' punter, Sean Landeta?
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, Raul Allegre, now this is the stuff that's surprising to me, is there's a great story in there about the kickers. There was a guy, Joe Cooper, who kicked for the Giants for 2 weeks that season. He lived in this Italian couple's basement in Lodi, New Jersey. And he's from the farm country of California. He's there, and he's telling me, I'm like, well, what did you, they made him dinner, and I said, well, what did you eat? He said, well, it was bow tie pasta, and it was, they had this, it was with sausage, and it was this red. I go, what did they call it? He goes, well, they called it gravy.
Yeah.
To me, we're going to laugh. People up here know what that means.
That's an old-fashioned term for the sauce. It's gravy.
The sauce, yeah. So, I mean, for that sort of fish. Now, that is funny to me. And then Raul Allegre, he gets cut. Raul Allegre comes in, and, he's living in the same basement then.
Oh, my God.
Switched him out. And Allegre becomes, Dana Carvey does a parody of Allegre the night before the Super Bowl. Allegre can't go to sleep that night, and he's putting on Saturday Night Live, and he sees Dana Carvey doing this very ethnic, parody of Allegre, and it relaxed him, actually. So to me, that's like something like that, and that entry into pop culture is super interesting. And the book is filled with that sort of detail and nuggets that are out there. So, that's for me the writer, but it's different. It's like, what do you like best about your kid versus what are other people's impressions? So I think I gave you both answers there. I think the big takeaway they have is they've been surprised at the level of drug use. But for me, it's those little nuggets, that those intersections with culture and pop culture that come up throughout the book.
Well, those are always the most interesting things, I think, because it shows the real people. And let me ask you one other quick thing. This team seemed like, for those of us who lived in North Jersey at the time, this was the first New Jersey champion team, really, because, all the New York teams had been in New York. And here's the Giants. They moved to New Jersey. Of course, we all know when they moved to Meadowlands, people are, what is this? What is the Meadowlands? Why are we in a swamp? And people aren't going to go to see football games there. Then they brought the first real championship to New Jersey, and it allowed, and you had a lot of these players living. I know Phil Sims still lives in Franklin Lakes, and a lot of these people still live here. Parcells was a Jersey guy, though, too, right?
Yeah, originally he was, and Hasbrook Heights and Englewood. Yep.
Yeah, so talk about, and then I'll let you go. Talk about kind of what it meant to North Jersey to kind of get this respectability, and also have these players live here when most New York athletes didn't, because the teams were in New York, and what that kind of did to North Jersey in the 80s.
Yeah, well, they were definitely part of the community, because also athletes didn't make the amount of money that they make today. So Phil Sims went to pick up his own dry cleaning.
Oh, my God.
Drafted, he was making the same amount of money as the sanitation worker that lived next to him in the house he rented in Lyndhurst.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, so they were part of the community. And as far as, I find it very entertaining, because there is this New Jersey, New York battle that pops up in the book. And, the idea that when the Giants won this Super Bowl, Ed Koch, so the Mets won the World Series in '86.
Yep.
And they had this big parade for them. And Koch said the Giants hadn't even gotten to the Super Bowl, and he said, "We will not have a parade for them." and American Express said, "Well, we'll sponsor it. We'll pay for all the cleanup. You got to have a parade." I mean, they hadn't won the NFC Championship game, and Koch is coming out saying this. And there's great story about Chris Mara, who is one of the Mara sons and a top executive there with the Giants today. About him at the NFC Championship game, and if you remember this game, the wind is swirling, and the people have turned the game programs and toilet paper and whatever else and newspapers into their own ticker tape, and
that's right, yeah,
like a storm at the stadium. And Chris Mara said, "I stood in the end zone, and I looked up at this, and I put my middle finger up in the air for Ed Koch."
Excellent. Yeah, I don't think that was one of Koch's better moments.
Jersey, yeah, there is that New York, New Jersey feel of things and battle that occurs throughout.
Excellent. Well, we've been talking to Jerry Barca, author of Big Blue Wrecking Crew, Smash Mouth Football, a little bit of crazy, and the '86 Super Bowl champion New York Giants. I can't believe it's been 30 years. But this is a lot of new info, a lot of good updated retrospective. You will be at Words Bookstore Thursday night, 7:30, and with special guest Mark Bavaro, who will be chatting with you about this. That'll be a fun event. Get the book. We've already gotten a nice taste of some of the tidbits, but I think there's a lot more that people will enjoy, whether you were around then or are a more recent Giant fan, to know this history and the sort of colorful background that maybe doesn't really exist today in a lot of these teams. And we'll see you there, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Be well.